on a couple of your energy resources lectures. So I think that your sort of the philosophy of leadership that you presented up here and your main core tenets of it are really fascinating. I'd be interested to hear how those evolved over time, or if there was some lesson that you learned at one point that really showed you aspects of this that were important to you. Because at some point, I'm sure you didn't have the leadership model that you've presented up here.
Yeah, well, I don't think I would have ever described myself as having a leadership model until Sherry asked me to give a talk. It's like, okay, so what do I think about leadership? But I think the word focus, clearly that being asked 200 times, whether it was 190 or 300 times out of business school, what did you get out of business school? The fact that I could never think of a better word or way to bumper sticker it than the word focus. So clearly business school played a big role for me in that. I don't know. I think my business partner, when I was asking, he said, he was saying, when's the first time you can remember really sticking your neck out? You know, because part of it, aside from these kinds of activities, you know, I am on a few committees and things like that, and I find I now, when people say, oh, will you be on this committee? I warn them, and I say, well, I'm only going to be on this committee if you're comfortable with the fact that I'm not just going to, you know, go with the flow. So, and I really limit how many things I do. So I don't think, and these are just, you know, the title I didn't have is these are just kind of breadcrumbs from an experience. I've just been going. I've been this doer leader, and I don't, other than what I've shared with you, I don't know how to explain how I got here. So I have to believe, like for many of us, that nature nurture thing. You know, I decided I was going to be a geologist when I was, a sophomore in high school. But you know, you all have experiences of things you did in high school and college. You know, I grew up here in Palo Alto. So it's just that whole idea of tuning in and realizing it's okay to explore things that you care about. And part of what my challenge now is figure out how can I help my own kids do this, because I didn't have someone helping me do it at the time, but I took an art class at Coverly High School that's now closed, and I discovered I had never really gotten excited about history, but my art teacher started telling me about art history, and it was like I fell in love. And the next thing I know, so at the time, I'd been riding my bike around campus, and there were all these Rodin sculptures on campus, and I was fascinated by those. So, you know, I just kept following things that interested me, and the next thing I know, you know, I took an advanced placement test in art history the first year they offered them, because the studio art teacher said, hey, there's this test, do you want to? I'll mail for it and take it, and I did that, and people were like, how'd you do that? Well, it's because I just followed. Again, I think almost everybody at Stanford is here because they've followed things they're excited about. So this doesn't feel like it's just being me. I wish I could share something more useful. But I think that I've tried to make that one of my messages really, is be yourself. Try and maintain that authenticity and so one of the pieces of advice I've given to students over the years that I advise is in your summer jobs and the things before you really need to feel like you need to hunker down, just if someone offers you an opportunity to do something that feels, well, I'm not sure if I like that or not. I mean, I was a management consultant for a summer in business school because somebody called me and said, do you want to come work in London for the summer? I was pretty sure I didn't want to be a management consultant, but I wasn't sure. I mean, how bad can it be to go work in London for the summer? I learned a ton about what I didn't want to do. And no offense to the management consultants in the room, which I know there's one. And I was just on the phone with one of our investors today saying, in the particular role I was in as a management consultant, I felt uncomfortable. This is a little blunt to be captured on tape, but I felt like an information whore. I felt like my job was to go get people to give me information. And I was so uncomfortable with it that I knew I needed to go get that information, but I worked really hard to try and figure out something that would be useful to the person who was going to give me the information. And I kind of had an unwritten code that for me to feel good, I would try and give them more information useful to them than they would give me, even if I had to circle back 6 months later to give it to them. So that was a really interesting lesson I learned out of a management consulting job, where part of it is I met great people. I learned it's really valuable to don't hurt yourself, but it's just as useful to know what you don't want to do and what you're not good at as it is to know what you do want to do. I call it reverse Polish logic a little bit, which is a bad use of that whole phrase. But it's because I wasn't sure about a bunch of things. But that's where risk and reward come in, which is just go try it, and it'll teach you some things. So, anybody else? Yeah?
So what got you to do an MBA after you were out 3 years?
That's a good question. That's a good question. So my dad, who died when I was 19, had gone to Harvard Business School. And he was a very intellectual MBA. He worked for Stanford Research Institute, and he did market research. And he would come home from a long day at work, and he would sit in a particular chair. Maybe you had parents who came home from work and did this. And he would read the Wall Street Journal. I was like, And for me, I knew I was interested in science, and I was interested, it was just this weird thing, Sherry, where I applied to Stanford and Harvard Business School. I went through UC Santa Barbara in 3 years, and right out of undergrad, I applied to Stanford and Harvard Business School. So I must have known very early on that I wanted to be in that world. And fortunately, those institutions are smart enough to say, that's really nice you want to come here, but you need to go get a little experience first. And in the end, I ended up choosing to go, I went straight to graduate school in geology undergrad. And then, but that's more like nature to me. I don't know why, but I feel like I always, not always, but for a long time was pointed that way. And part of it was I think I experienced being a scientist and developing enough credentials there and had a broad view. After my master's degree in geology, I went to work for ARCO in Denver for 3 years. And I had a very unusual job, which was part of the privilege of coming from a place like Stanford, is when a substantial company says, ooh, this person from Stanford, and I want to be careful about not sounding arrogant about Stanford, but I think how some of the world responds and say, well, this is someone who we can put in an unusual situation. So I was put on a team with about 7 gentlemen older than my dad was, who been there, really smart people, and we did a national study of kind of a resource assessment. And my job was to look at all the layers of rock in the country that could have natural gas in them, which ended up being very helpful for starting my business, which I didn't know at the time. And because of the work I was doing, I interviewed this is where my management consulting skills came in handy. I ended up interviewing about 1,500 geoscientists in ARCO, in government, and other companies to help ARCO to do this study. And word got out that I was doing that, and the next thing I knew, I found myself being the managing editor of a 400-page technical book with 30 papers and what's times 4, about 120 authors. Because people somehow, again, at that point, somebody had figured out that I have this tenacious thing where I get stuff done. I am not the smartest person in the room, but I love getting stuff done. And so the experience to me of figuring out in my early 20s that I could, so the reason they wanted me involved in this book is I had 2 co-editors who were the Einsteins, the super bright guys, but getting a book out the door is a project. It's a enterprise project. And so they said, we think because of things they'd heard about me in the studies, and we think maybe you can get this done. And it really mattered to get this book published by a certain date because it coincided with a big meeting and lots of attendees, and you're supposed to buy the book at the meeting. In the last 3 years before me, the book had come out 6 months after the meeting and had not sold well. So it was like this challenge to me. It's like, ooh, I'll try this. And I did that, and it worked out well. And so to me, I started to realize there's this opportunity. It wasn't binary. You're not either a scientist or a capitalist. You can leverage the fact that you have credibility and some panache as a scientist, and then you can overlay on that the get things done part. And so I ended up telling that story about the book in my business school application. So it's always interesting in the rearview mirror. At the time you're inventing it, again, at the time I was creating in my life story the things I'm now reflecting on, all I was doing things that sounded cool to me. And I guess an important lesson for me, I talked about being a connector, and some of you have read the book or watched the video, the last lecture. And if you haven't read it or watched it, I encourage you to. One of the adages, write thank you notes. So the metaphor for me is I did a reasonably good job of staying in touch with people who had influenced me. And that has been, and just being in touch with people and circling back, and it goes back to this kind of community building, And if you're not good at that, finding people who work with you who are good at that, it ends up providing all these really interesting, it's a great network. It's very valuable. And certainly, if graduate students here at Stanford, you'll look back in the rearview mirror, you'll get to work with all kinds of interesting people in your future, but the people that you work with here are great. If you can figure out how to stay in touch with the people that matter, you'll be really glad you did so when you fast forward your life to a place like where I am now. So, thanks for listening.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.